Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 44 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Dr. Mark Stout, who has held many positions both inside and outside the U.S. intelligence community. He's worked as an intelligence analyst for the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He's worked for the CIA and has been a civilian employee for the U.S. Army at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. He was also the historian for the International Spy Museum from 2010 until 2013, and was the director of the Masters in Arts program for Global Security Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and the former and founding president of the North American Society for Intelligence History. And if that weren't enough, he's also authored and edited several books and been published in many professional journals over the years. But before we get into Mark's work, I want to let you all know about a new educational tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal app for convenient, real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally just $5 per month, but if you use the code GBC Spycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot ever since I first subscribed. Look it up yourself at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com. And use the discount code GBC Spycraft to save 20% right from the start. Mark, I'm really glad that we could get together for this because I've been wanting to talk to you for quite a long time now.
Well, that's very kind of you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that you've written about many different aspects of intelligence history over the years, but there was one article in particular that caught my eye, and I knew that my listeners would love to hear about it from you. It's your 2004 article on The Pond, a little-known private American intelligence organization that existed for about 12 years during the 1940s and 1950s. And because there is so little documentation available for The Pond, it looks like you're probably one of the world's foremost experts on it. So I'm grateful that you are here now to share some of that research with us.
Well, thank you. I'm probably one of the few people silly enough to spend so much time researching such a difficult and annoying topic, but it's fascinating.
Well, we're all grateful to you for doing that for certain. So The Pond is, to me, I mean, right off the bat, that's a very unique name for an intelligence entity. And it's a private intelligence entity, which I know are not very well known. I think I would have thought that was more of a fictional device rather than something real, and not just real, but from American history as well. So for starters, can you tell us what exactly was The Pond?
Yeah, sure. So The Pond started its life in 1942, actually as an intrinsic component of the War Department's military intelligence service in Washington. And it was conducting espionage for the War Department during the war. And then at the end of the war, some back and forth, but basically it transitioned into being a private company, initially under the name of the Universal Service Corporation, which I think is a wonderfully generic, sort of good intel kind of name, later Industrial Reports Incorporated. And it then did espionage on contract for the State Department for about 3 years. And then the CIA took it over in 1951, and it did contract espionage for the agency until 1955, at which point it came to an end. And it was also an organization that, we'll probably get into more details on this, liked to conduct espionage in a very different way from the way the Office of Strategic Services during the war did it, and the way that the OSS's main successor, the CIA, did it. So it was this very odd beast that had a short and dramatic life in World War II and the early Cold War.
Wow, that's exactly what we're here to learn about. Believe me, that's what my people love. I can tell you already. So the name The Pond, where does that come from? Because you mentioned Universal Service Corporation, I think, which is great and more in line with what I would have imagined. But The Pond seems very just unique, really.
Yeah, so that is a question that I would love to be able to answer because I don't know the answer for it. All I can tell you is that it starts showing up in Pond documents right about the end of World War II. While it was part of the War Department, it had a couple different official names. It was the Special Service Branch and a bunch of other things. And I don't know where the Pond came from. All I can tell you is that the records of the Pond use just a gazillion code words and cryptonyms. And for whatever reason, that's the one they chose for themselves. And the other intelligence agencies or sort of big national security agencies around Washington had similar kinds of names, involving water. So Bay was the CIA, for instance, and there was a lake and there was an ocean and so forth and so on that were, the War Department and the State Department and so forth and so on. But why they chose pond, how they got into bodies of water, I hope someday I will find the answer. But at this point, having been working on this for 21 years, I guess, I'm not very optimistic.
Wow. I can imagine. So when you say the water-related terms, those were given by the pond to the other organizations? They weren't bestowed by some larger branch of the government?
No, this was, sort of purely inside baseball in the pond. They like to use all sorts of cryptonyms like that. And that's been actually one of the challenges over the years researching this organization is that these documents are really hard to read because there are not a lot of, true names of people or of organizations in them. One of my big sort of tasks along the way has been putting together a very lengthy, what I call crib sheet of like this code word refers to this and this cryptonym refers to that. It's a heavy slog.
Well, since it's so little known and since it's so poorly documented, how did you yourself first learn about the pond?
Yeah, great question. So this was around about 2000, I guess, something like that. And I was an analyst at the CIA. I was not at the CIA on their history staff. I was not a quote unquote CIA historian, but I was very interested in intelligence history. And I remember reading some book, and I don't actually recall what it was, but it was about the history of the CIA. It might have been Thomas Troy's book. I don't recall. But at any rate, there were, 2-3 sentences, maybe a paragraph on this organization. And I went to Hayden Peak, who at that time ran the historical intelligence collection within the CIA's library. And I said, Hayden, what's with these guys? What's with this thing? It sounds very interesting, this Grombach thing. And he said to me, Mark, everybody who knows about early CIA history has heard of that, but nobody knows what it did. And if you could figure out, you'd have made a big contribution. And because that sort of appealed to the same instincts in me that, made doing intelligence analysis fun, I basically took this on as a hobby. And, I'd spend weekends at the National Archives back when the National Archives was open on weekends, but that's a different story. And, in all seriousness, a good day at the archives, I'd find one document. That is the extent to which the records had been really scrubbed. So it was slow going. It was not the kind of thing that a professional historian would work on who lives in a publish or perish environment because the return on investment of time was just so minimal. But for me, it was a hobby. And I managed to put together enough bits and pieces that by shortly after I left the CIA, which is in 2003, in 2004, I was able to publish that first article in Studies in Intelligence on this subject, which is out there on the internet and is by far the most read thing I've ever done. That said, I've continued working on this over the years, and there's been two sort of big streams of, additional sources that I've been able to bring to bear. And I've published a couple of other things in more recent years, expanding on the story, and I'm hoping to do a book. I'll probably start writing it next year. And first off is there are little bits and pieces of correspondence and documents from Grombach, not usually so much the pond itself, but Grombach and his associates in special collections in various university libraries around the country. So, a correspondent of his, maybe somebody he'd worked with in an intelligence capacity, might have left his papers to the university of wherever, right? And they'd be there, and there'd be, 3, 4, 5 letters. And as the World Wide Web sort of grew and as more and more of these special collection finding aids got put online, every year I was able to discover, oh, there's a little repository here and there's a little repository of records there, sort of accumulate those over the years. The other thing, and much bigger, is that right about the time I was leaving the agency, in fact, literally with 2 weeks to go at the agency, I got a call from a colleague on the history staff at CIA and said, hey, I've heard you're working on Grombach. I've got something here you might want to see. Do you want to come to the building that we're in and have a look at it? Like, I was intrigued. And I went there, and the agency had come into possession, and we can talk if you want about how, but the agency had come into possession of a large collection of the office files of the Pond, of Grombach's espionage organization. At the time, these were all classified, but they had me look through them to sort of help give them a sense of like what they had. But I wasn't able to use any of that stuff in my 2004 article because it was all classified. 7 years go by, and eventually these things show up at the National Archives in College Park. And to their credit, the CIA had been very forthcoming in declassifying stuff. There was almost nothing that they took out of those records before they opened it up to researchers. That stuff showed up at the National Archives in 2010, and that increased like literally 2 orders of magnitude, by 2 orders of magnitude at the very least, sort of amount of records available. And I was actually able, in at least some cases, to sort of put together continuing threads of their story. But as I say, these records are, hard to work with. So that's how we know what we know.
When you mentioned that they came to light, am I remembering correctly, these were discovered in a house or something like that?
Yeah. It's a very odd story. So yeah, somewhere around about, and I forget the precise date now, I wasn't involved in this bit of it, but somewhere around about 2001, 2002, somebody purchased some property down in Central Virginia that had what I've heard is a barn on it. I don't know if that's actually true. I haven't been there, but let's go with it, a barn. And they discovered in the barn some safes for which the new owner did not have the combination. So they, pried them open, and documents saying things on them like top secret spilled out. Like, well, that's not good. Right. And so apparently this person called the FBI and said, hey, I got some stuff here. Not sure what it is, but I'm pretty sure I shouldn't have it. Can I give it to you? The FBI came, they looked at it, and they said, this looks like CIA stuff. And literally, it got delivered to the loading dock at a CIA facility in the Washington, D.C. area, where the history staff, among other things, was. And it was these records. And apparently what had happened was that Grombach had been keeping, in his personal files, all this stuff about this very classified work that he'd done for the War Department and then the State Department and then the CIA. The espionage work of his organization. He'd been keeping this stuff personally, which the dangers of private companies doing intel. At some point or another, he'd apparently sort of passed custody of these along to somebody associated with a group called the American Security Council, which frankly I don't know a whole lot about, but it was a Cold War era conservative organization interested in national security stuff. I mean, my general impression is something perhaps sort of similar to the Committee on the Present Danger of the Reagan era, if you remember that, but kind of less important. And I think it had got stuck in one of their buildings and then sold off at some point or another. So the CIA looked at this stuff and, realized, fortunately, what they had and called me in, but I wasn't actually able to make any use of that stuff for, 7 full years after I became aware of its existence. So.
Wow, what a story. You mentioned that they do things a little differently, and that's certainly differently, just to take all the documents home with you.
Yeah, not really good practice, I would say, but...
Yeah, probably not, but it worked out well in the end, at least that they were finally discovered and came into the public knowledge.
Absolutely.
So you've mentioned the name Grombach several times. He was the founder of the Pond, correct?
That's right. John V. Grombach. He was actually born Jean Valentin Grombach. He was born in New Orleans at the turn of the century. Well, gosh, we've had a turn of the century. The turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
Right.
Boy, that's depressing. But at any rate, born in New Orleans, the son of French parents, and his father, French immigrant parents, that is to say, his father ran a company that made postcards. In fact, you can buy Grombach postcards on eBay if you go there. But also his father apparently held some sort of, a little unclear, but some sort of honorary position as an honorary consul, French government in New Orleans. Interestingly enough, I've recently discovered that Grombach was Jewish. His parents were were Jewish and were born at one of the most famous synagogues in all of France before they immigrated to the United States. And this is interesting because I found this basically pursuing sort of genealogical records. You see absolutely zero reflection of this in his correspondence and anything. There's no records. I've got his appointment diaries. He doesn't talk about going to synagogues or anything. In fact, he talks about going to mass a couple of times. He appears to have spent his entire professional career obscuring the fact that he was Jewish. But at any rate, he grew up in New Orleans and ended up going to West Point. He would have been in the class of he was in the class of 1923 for a while, but he got himself thrown out of West Point literally the day before graduation for having earned just too many demerits. He ended up getting his degree from VMI. And he served in the National Guard for a while in the interwar period, did a stint down in Panama in 26-27, where he claims to have gotten his first sort of experience with intelligence matters, though I've been unable to find any records on what the heck he was talking about. And eventually he migrated into private life. And in the interwar, he spent most of the interwar period working in the radio business, not as an on-air personality, but as a producer of radio programming. But he stayed in the National Guard on, sort of drilling status. And when World War II came along, he was actually his guard unit was part of the 27th Infantry Division, was supposed to ship out to the Pacific, but friends interceded, thinking that he had some skills in intelligence, and he got himself assigned to the Military Intelligence Division in the War Department. One thing led to another. He's a really colorful, interesting guy. Not only was he thrown out of West Point, he was a very, very serious fencer through much of his life. He was actually an alternate on the U.S. Olympic team, on the Olympic modern pentathlon team at the 1924 Paris Olympics. He was also a very serious amateur boxer. He maintained interest in both of these things throughout his life. And in fact, at one point, in the 50s, he discovered and co-managed the guy named Laurent Dauteuil. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but who fought Jake LaMotta for the title. In fact, in the movie Raging Bull, that fight appears. And in fact, I'm told that there's some extra in the background who's meant to be Grombach. I don't know if that's true or not. He was also a pretty hardcore right-wing kind of guy, sort of right-wing in the sort of inclined towards the Joseph McCarthy view of the world, and used to enjoy sort of as a side project writing articles for magazines with titles like Kill or Be Killed or other sorts of things for men's magazines. Back when that didn't necessarily mean porn, it meant adventure kinds of magazines aimed at men. So he was an interesting, very colorful guy. I don't think I would have liked him if I'd known him, but I find him really fascinating.
Right. Well, he does sound like he was already living quite a life, but it doesn't sound necessarily like he's a great fit to lead an intelligence organization, just from what you've said so far. So not exactly that happened.
Well, no, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think a lot of this can really be encapsulated by a performance evaluation he got when he was an Army officer in 1946, if I recall correctly. He got pretty good ratings on many of the sort of standards they're rated against, and he got the highest possible rating on physical fitness. But for things like intelligence and judgment, he got mediocre ratings, which in an Army context is, you're horrible. But everything's grade inflated. So yeah, he was the kind of guy who tended to react very emotionally and to see the world in very stark kind of Manichaean terms. You're either with me or you're either incompetent or a communist or probably both.
Wow.
So
words to live by, huh? So how did that translate into this position that he found himself in right after the end of the war?
The precise way or reasons why he got transferred from the 27th Infantry Division, where he wasn't an intel officer, to the War Department intel staff is not clear to me. But he arrives in early 42. He's immediately loaned part-time to the Office of Strategic Services, to the OSS, to help them stand up a small signals intelligence organization within the OSS, which ultimately kind of fizzles. That's a different and longer story that I'm not the expert on anyway. But they apparently turned to him because he had expertise in radio, right? He'd been working in radio for most of the interwar period. And the OSS was kind of an organization that would, if you've even vaguely got some sort of expertise in something, even if you're not exactly optimal for the purpose, we will use you for it. And so the War Department in London to do that. He then, in the course of doing that, was on loan to them for about 6 months, he thoroughly alienated everybody he met in the OSS. And okay, thank you for your service. You can go back to the War Department now. And in the meantime, the War Department had come to the conclusion that it needed its own independent capability to conduct espionage. And there were a couple of things going on here. So the War Department did have something called the Counterintelligence Corps, which actually dated back under a different name to World War I, that sort of did espionage, but as its name implied, very much focused on security and counterintelligence stuff, whereas the War Department was looking for, a capability to conduct espionage, to collect, what at the time would have been called by some positive intelligence. And the G2 of the Army, a guy named General George Strong, wanted to have such a capability, and he furthermore, Strong loathed William Donovan and the OSS. Just thought they were awful and shouldn't exist, more to the point. And so in Strong's mind, and I'm doing a little bit of inference here. I mean, I know Strong was involved, and I know for a fact Strong's views on the OSS. I think basically Strong looked at this as an opportunity to create a capability to rival the OSS so that we don't have to depend on them for our, secret intelligence. It's not clear, I haven't been able to find any records directly on the establishment of it. I've seen indications that George C. Marshall, General Marshall, who at the time was Chief of Staff of the Army, and or his deputy, General Joseph McNarney, greenlit this. Probably one of them did, but I haven't been able to find any smoking gun. But basically, this came out of the Army doesn't have a good espionage capability, and it sure doesn't want to depend on the OSS, which it would like to stamp out of existence. So we'll create our own, but we'll keep it super secret from everybody. This is a time, in the war where all kinds of new things are happening, and they're throwing, everybody in the military is, throwing bodies at, like, you're a warm body. We need X done, you do X, you're here. And I think that's more or less what happened with Grombach in setting up this organization. But he really took to it. He was frankly a conspiratorial sort of guy in the way he looked at the world. And, to some degree that fit fairly well with the world of espionage, where, it's about lying and doing things secretly.
Right, certainly.
That sort of thing.
So you mentioned it was super secret. How super secret was it exactly? How many people were involved at the top in the, above Grombach anyway, that were aware of what he was doing?
So that's not entirely clear. I know the senior leadership of the Military Intelligence Division, the War Department G2, Strong, certainly somebody above Strong. We know that President Roosevelt, there's strong indication that President Roosevelt at least was vaguely aware of it, because essentially he was asked to greenlight a particular wartime project that involved working with Otto von Habsburg, who theoretically would have been the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne if Austria-Hungary had existed. But what we do know is that they never told the OSS that this existed. They never told the Office of Naval Intelligence that this existed. And most of the vast majority of the people in the War Department who were not directly involved in running this thing, intel or otherwise, were not told that it existed either. Interestingly enough, who they did tell and actually worked with very closely from the very beginning was the State Department, which, is pretty odd. And the reason for that was that their idea from early on was that in order to not look like what the German adversary, in this case, later the Soviets, would expect from espionage, is, hey, it would really help if we actually use real State Department diplomats as an intrinsic part of our organization. And so early on, they struck a deal with the State Department where the State Department would assign them particular diplomats serving in a country they wanted to have an espionage capability in. So there'd be a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy who would be a no kidding, honest to God U.S. diplomat who'd receive possibly a few days of training on espionage tradecraft, or maybe not. And this person, in some cases, would actually be a case officer out there actually recruiting sources. Most of the time, however, that person was a conduit, and there would be non-governmental officials, business people, journalists, whoever, frequently who weren't even Americans, who were actually conducting espionage or running, sort of a network of people conducting espionage. And they would report what they got to this person, this diplomat at the State Department, who would then encrypt it in the Pond special cipher, and then encrypt that in the State Department special cipher, or code actually more often, and send it back to a particular office at the State Department, which would strip out the State Department encryption, pass the thing over to the War Department, which would strip out the Pond encryption, and there you'd have the message, right? Or they'd use the State Department diplomatic pouch. Yeah, so they were using real diplomats, and then a whole lot of what these days would be called non-official cover, which is a capability that intelligence agencies use these days too. Typically, non-official cover is not the backbone of an espionage organization, but that's the way Grombach did it from the very beginning.
Well, I have to admit that's really brilliant in a way, to bring the State Department in and just have those communication channels already built in and that diplomatic status built in. That seems like that would shortcut a lot of the problems with standing up an agency from scratch.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, you can draw on all sorts of infrastructure, right? HR and finance and all of that, right? The State Department's recruiting these people, the State Department's paying them, and all that sort of stuff you don't have to do. That's absolutely right. I mean, the downside, of course, is that because the State Department folks are real diplomats, this is a side job that in most cases, they did once for one tour and never came back to it. There were some people who came back, did multiple stints as the Pond guy in, country A, and then 6 years later in country B kind of thing. But that was fairly rare. So they don't really develop any expertise in it. They're not necessarily the most security conscious people in the world, just by virtue of the fact that, the business of diplomacy is really fundamentally different from the business of espionage. And then, depending on business people and journalists and, God knows who all else, you have less control over those kinds of people. You frequently know much less about them than somebody that you can, thoroughly vet and give a U.S. government security clearance to. And in some cases, as I think I just mentioned, some of these are foreigners, are not even Americans, right? There's a lot of convenience. You're absolutely right. And and in one sense, from a security perspective, it's probably not what your adversaries are expecting. And so that's always good. But it also assumes a lot of risk in a lot of other ways.
Certainly. Yeah, that's shocking that they would have non-citizens, non-Americans that were fully recruited and employed by the agency. I guess they would have had knowledge to all aspects of the operation, right? Not just a limited piece they needed for their job.
Well, I mean, it would depend on the individual person, but yeah. And even back at the Pond, quote unquote headquarters, from the early days during World War II, so I think 1943, if I recall correctly, and actually going all the way through the very end of the Pond's existence in early 1955, one of Grombach's most important associates who worked with him at headquarters was a man named Tibor Eckhart, who was Hungarian. And you may recall that the Hungarians fought on the side of the Nazis during World War II. Now, Eckhart was decidedly not a Nazi. He was the head of a conservative, but decidedly not Nazi party in Hungary, who fled the country, if I recall correctly, 1941, maybe 1940, but before the war on the Eastern Front broke out, to sort of form the basis of maybe not a government in exile in the United States, but a foothold in the United States, like in case Hungary, gets forced into fighting alongside the Nazis. Yeah, and he didn't become a U.S. citizen for, many, until after he was, after the Pond was gone. And he was the Central Europe sort of operations chief, if you will, right? This guy who was a citizen of Hungary, which fought World War II as an ally of the Nazis, and then shortly after World War II became a Soviet satellite state, right? And he was the Pond's Central Europe guy. So
yeah, there's some incredible pivots that happened in a very short period of time there in the mid to late 40s.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it continually blows my mind, all the research I've done into that era. So out of this very, very unusual organization and unusual strategy, did they have any major successes or major operations that they ran?
So this is an interesting question. They did some interesting things, some of which I've been able to figure out, as I know enough to say that there was something interesting going on, but I don't know what the heck it was. I would say a couple of things. I'd point to two or three things. So during the war, they did have a lot of success actually working with the Hungarians, thanks to Tibor Eckhart and then Otto von Habsburg, who was, an Eckhart ally, I guess. Through those folks, they were able to make contact with a sub-community of Hungarian diplomats, particularly Hungarian diplomats serving in the Hungarian embassy in Lisbon, which was a neutral country, but also serving at the Hungarian embassy in Switzerland and Madrid and Ankara. So I made contact with Hungarian diplomats who were very much opposed to Hungary's role in the war, to the fact that Hungary had been forced into an alliance with Hitler late on in the war, that Hungary was ruled by a no kidding honest to God fascist government. So what they were able to do then was the Pond was able to sort of lash up with these folks and get not only information about what's going on in the Hungarian diplomatic world, which obviously included information about Hungary's diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, but also the Hungarian diplomats had connections with Hungarian military officers who also were very unhappy about what was going on in the direction that their country was going in. And they were able to provide reporting on things like what's going on the Eastern Front, because the Hungarians were fighting on the Eastern Front, and information from things like the Hungarian military attaché in Berlin about what was going on there, mundane but important things like what kind of bomb damage were the latest Allied bombing raids able to do from an on-ground perspective, stuff like that. So that was very useful. They also had people reporting from occupied Norway and occupied France. So the records on both of those are extremely scarce. They're just tiny bits and pieces. And then in the post-war era, post-World War II era, it gets a lot harder. And one of the things that, probably skipping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that led to the State Department being willing to cough up this contract to the CIA in 1951, and then the CIA ending the contract in early 1955, was that the perceived quality of the reporting, the information that the Pond spies stole, was pretty low. The State Department and the CIA, later the CIA, just didn't think they were getting value for their money, among other problems, to be honest. But, it's hard to point unambiguously to things. I would say that the Pond recruited a couple of sources in the Czechoslovak embassy in Paris, and apparently through them, though this is a little unclear, was able to acquire cryptographic materials from the Czech government that may or may not have allowed the United States to read Czechoslovak encrypted communications. It gets pretty complex, but Grombach, the CIA, and the National Security Agency got into a sort of a three-cornered food fight over this, which, in typical Grombach fashion, he claimed that he was being cheated. But there may have been some successes there. But to be honest with you, a lot of the records show sort of pretty low-level stuff going on of not, tremendous significance. And a lot of the other stuff is just really hard to figure out, exactly what is going on here. Mm-hmm. But those are two things that I would point to.
Okay, that actually sounds like they were able to move into a lot of different areas. And honestly, to me, that sounds pretty good for an organization that was so new at that time.
Yeah, it's true. And they grew very quickly. And by the end of World War II, for instance, they were claiming, now I don't know what they're counting here, but they were claiming that they had 800 operatives around the world, and they were operating in, 32 countries or something like this. I do know that by the time they got shut down by the CIA in the mid-50s, they were operating in the Far East, in Vietnam, French Indochina at the time. They were operating in India. They were operating in North Africa and the Middle East and all over Western Europe, and had or thought they had, and that's another issue, sources in most of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe plus Yugoslavia. As far as I'm aware, they never claimed to have actually penetrated the Soviet Union itself. But yeah, they were, the organization was pretty far flung, and they did this actually with pretty small budget for a couple of reasons. So number one, and you touched on an aspect of this before, a lot of the officials involved in this are State Department folks, and their salaries coming from the State Department, so that's free. Two, espionage fundamentally is not tremendously expensive, right? This is not like flying spy satellites or doing, signals intelligence operation where you have to buy a bunch of top-notch computers and stuff. But also, a lot of the folks that they had operating under non-official cover, again, they weren't having to pay their salaries. Their salaries were being paid by whatever business they worked for or whatever magazine staff they were on or whatever it was. A lot of their sources, they didn't pay. Their view on this was that many of our sources are so ideologically committed to defeating global communism that they're not requiring money. That was doubtless true in some cases. I suspect, though I can't put my fingers on any individual case, that probably a bunch of these folks were not being paid because they were actually conduits for disinformation by foreign intelligence services. And okay. The important thing is to get the fake info to American intel. It's not to necessarily to get paid for it. But also, during the war at least, possibly after, but during the war at least, some of their operations were in part subsidized by private companies. So, for instance, during World War II, and this is the biggest example, though I know there were others, that we have much less detail on them. During World War II, they basically made an alliance with a Dutch company called NV Philips, which at the time was primarily a company that made light bulbs. In the post-war, they got much more into sort of electronics generally, and you may be familiar with like Philips televisions, for instance, in recent times, that company. So it was a Dutch company, which operated, had a subsidiary, I'm not a business guy, but operated in a lot of places outside the Netherlands. When Germany occupies the Netherlands in 1940, the company's leadership flees. They approach the U.S. government and they say, hey, we're Dutch. We are very unhappy with the fact that our country is occupied by the Germans, and we'd like to help the United States liberate in the war effort that will result in liberating our country. And oh, by the way, we have a presence, around much of the world. We also actually have this in-house sort of intelligence network that we've used for our own business purposes, but we're happy to put all of this at your disposal. And by the way, we're happy to subsidize your intelligence operations by writing checks. Yeah, during World War II, I don't know the proportion of the PON budget that actually was paid for by this Dutch light bulb company, but the documents I have seen wrote about it as if it were a significant thing, right, in the PON's operations. So they did stuff like that too. So money was coming from all sorts of places. And I guess one other quick thing, I would say that the first private company that Grombach set up to do this was Universal Service Corporation. Later on, he sets up Industrial Reports Incorporated, which is in essence as a cover organization, but there was a legitimate, if you will, side to it where it was basically a private investigation agency that would do things like background investigations on people that companies were thinking of hiring, right? So I'm just making this up, but some New York bank wants to hire a new executive. They might hire Industrial Reports Incorporated to do some due diligence and make sure this guy's okay before they hire him. So that was bringing in revenue as well, that I'm pretty sure was also helping fund espionage.
My goodness, yeah, they had their fingers on a lot of pies, but it certainly worked out pretty well.
Yes, they did.
There was one other guy I wanted to ask you about. Can you talk a little bit about this story about this French source, this Dr. Marcel Petiot? A little bit, that guy, his story.
Marcel Petiot, yeah, Petiot. This is an interesting thing, and I will be honest with you. If I had the 2004 article, which was the very first thing I wrote on this subject, and I'm putting this together from bits and pieces, if I had that to write over again, or when I write my book, which I'm going to launch into next year, I think I'm going to be a little more cautious about this, but the story is as follows. Grombach always claimed, and ultimately very late in his life published a book that touches on this, that Marcel Petiot was a source for the PON during World War II. So who was Petiot? Petiot was a doctor who lived in Paris during the war. He was a serial killer. He pretended that he had access to a rat line, basically, that could get people out of France who needed to escape. And he had a way of getting them to South America. He would take their money to facilitate their escape from France, and then he'd kill them. After the war, he was convicted of killing 26 people, but he may actually have killed as many as 60. So this guy was a serial killer. He also claims to have been involved with the French resistance, and Grombach claims that he was part of the PON network and that he was a source or maybe head of a network, a little unclear actually, but a source in Paris who was providing information on, what the German military in Paris was doing and sort of wartime doings in France. A couple of different biographies have been written of Petiot, one about a decade ago, and I corresponded pretty extensively with the author of that. And the problem is that sort of on the Petiot side, there's exactly zero to confirm this. And the PON records from World War II are, as I've said, very spotty and contain basically nothing on Petiot, but in fact, really very, very little on PON operations in France, just enough to indicate the PON was operating in France during the war. The biographer I corresponded with concluded, I think I don't agree with him, but I think quite reasonably that, Grombach was a fantasist and he was making all of this up. I don't think that's true, but I'm not in a position to really prove it at the moment. But what I can say is that there are references to Petiot in Grombach's records as somebody that he was interested in and researching from shortly after World War II on. And the other thing I would say, and perhaps more importantly, is Grombach had a very particular take on the world, as I've alluded to, right? That you were either with him or you were against him, and there were commies everywhere, and everybody in Washington is plotting to do me in. I mean, not in a physical sense, kill him, but to run his organization into the ground and all of this. But he wasn't a liar. I've never seen him, write or say anything that didn't bear a substantial resemblance to the truth. He may have had a strange take on things sometimes, but I cannot point to a single case where he was just making stuff up, at all. So if I had to guess now, and this is a guess, if I had to guess now, I think that Petiot probably was a source for the pond, but I wouldn't bet on him having been a good source in the sense of I wouldn't be surprised with what Petiot was stringing up, selling a bunch of lies to Grombach's network, much as he sold a bunch of lies to the people he was, told he was going to help them escape from France. But I'm not sure. So there is this very mysterious connection between Grombach, the pond, and one of the most infamous serial killers in all of French history.
That's fascinating for sure. And I have to admit, my first impression is, why would you want to lie about something that reflects so negatively on your organization and on you personally like that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And that gets to that same point of I think there was something there. In fact, I'd be very surprised if there wasn't, but I can't positively demonstrate beyond that. So as I say, that is one bit of that 2004 article I wish I had back a little bit now that I've had a chance to get access to more records and, and frankly, I've matured as a historian. It was a hobby then, but I think there was something there.
It's tantalizing story, certainly. I would love to know the full story.
There we go. Tantalizing story. We'll go with that.
Well, before we go on, I want to take a moment to fill you guys in on the newest tool I'm wearing and carrying in daily life. It's the Donovan non-metallic knife from Black Triangle. If you aren't familiar with Black Triangle, then you're really missing out. I love these guys because they put the dagger in Cloak and Dagger. If you've been following me for a while now, then you probably already know why Black Triangle is called their newest non-metallic knife, the Donovan. It's named after General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Under Donovan, the OSS was unconventional, unexpected, and highly effective, just like Black Triangle's tools. The Donovan is manufactured here in the United States. It's made entirely of G10 composite, and it comes with a thermoplastic sheath and a couple of amazing extras, which you'll have to see for yourself. You can find it at blacktriangle.com. That's blktriangle.com. You can also get 15% off your first order with Black Triangle using the discount code Spycraft101 or by navigating to blacktriangle.com/Spycraft101. I love mine, and I know you're going to love yours too. So, Mark, that kind of takes us up to the end of World War II, but then the organization went through a pretty significant transition at that point into the post-war period, just like almost everyone did, as a matter of fact, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Officially, the Pond was, which at that time was, I think, the Special Service branch of the Military Intelligence Service within the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department General Staff, it was stood down in November 1945. Its tendrils around the world sort of kept twitching. Then, though, in February, it was actually stood back up again, but with a new arrangement. Its headquarters moved from being, at the Pentagon to being in New York City, where they would be for the rest of its existence. They took up offices in the Steinway building on West 57th Street in Manhattan. And that was the Pond headquarters. And they maintained a small, essentially, liaison office in the War Department for a couple of years and continued to be on the, sort of the War Department payroll, but they were not an intrinsic part of the War Department General Staff anymore. Interestingly enough, at this time, Grombach was able to get the governor of New York, a guy named Thomas Dewey, to hide his, i.e. Grombach's chief of staff, who was an Army JAG officer, hide him in the New York State National Guard, where his real duties would be continuing to work for Grombach. So they had that kind of status for a couple of years. And towards the end of this, the War Department was like, not sure we need you anymore, in large part because Grombach was very hard to work with, to put it mildly. Secondly, because with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, we had the creation of the CIA. And basically, this sort of operation, this sort of strategic espionage kind of operations, those were all supposed to go to the CIA. And so the War Department was like, okay, we don't have a mandate. Like we have no legal excuse for paying your bills anymore, right? So there were a couple of reasons. And so Grombach is at loose ends, but he's able to get the State Department to secretly pick up the bill, which the State Department should not have been doing. I mean, remember, this kind of operation is supposed to, at this time, belong exclusively to the CIA. But for whatever reason, the State Department's willing to start paying their bills. It was on a bit of a shoestring budget, and that started in January of 1948. And that ran all the way until April, if I recall correctly, of 1951. So I guess 2.5 years, super roughly. They were able to sell the Director General of the Foreign Service and the leadership of the security component of State Department on this. Like, hey, we can't allow this thing to die. Like, we've worked with them since 1942. This is really important. Like, so they brought them on board to a contractor for the State Department. State Department was, well, a couple things went on. So it was not attached. The pond was not attached to the State Department's formal intelligence component, which at the time was called the R area. It's the predecessor to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where I worked in the 90s. It was actually not part of that, but it managed to get in food fights with that intel component of the State Department, unsurprisingly, because we're talking about John Grombach here. And also, over time, the department just wasn't impressed with the quality of the information that Grombach's network was bringing in. So CIA finds out that this thing is still out there, that State Department's not supposed to have, and State Department isn't super impressed with it, and Grombach's being a pain in the butt anyway. So a deal is brokered by which the CIA takes over that contract in 1951. And then, as I say, they ran it until 1955, at which point they got tired of a bunch of things. So first off, they also over time became less and less impressed with the quality of the reporting from the organization, though there were bits and pieces of it that they did find valuable. I don't think earth-shattering, but worth having. Broadly speaking, they weren't super impressed with what they were getting, so number one. Number two, Grombach had an amazing ability to alienate pretty much everybody he ever worked with at the agency. He'd had contempt, to put it mildly, for the OSS, and he carries that over to the CIA. He thought they were incompetent. He thought they didn't know how to properly conduct espionage operations, particularly with regard to security. He thought their concept of how to put this, well, let me put it this way. He believed that everything that his spies reported should be given to intelligence analysts, whereas the CIA had and has a process by which, all right, all the stuff that gets collected by the spies comes in, and like they sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, and only the stuff that looks like it positively might be useful do they show to the analysts. Well, he thought that was just wrongheaded. And furthermore, he would speak about the CIA behind its back to the FBI, an organization he always admired. And to read what Grombach writes, you'd think that he was good buddies with J. Edgar Hoover. Not really true, but whatever. On towards the end, also, the CIA started to get some suspicions, which I believe were well-grounded, that he was beginning to flirt with Senator Joseph McCarthy and his staffer, Roy Cohn, who, of course, were simply hostile to the CIA. So a bunch of things led to the agency eventually ending that contract.
Wow, yeah, sounds like everything just kind of culminated there, and Grombach was his own worst enemy.
I think that is a very good way of putting it. He really was his own worst enemy.
It's unfortunate because they sound like they accomplished quite a bit with not a whole lot in the way of resources to begin with, even if it was competing with the CIA in some ways. I mean, there was a real need in the mid-50s for collections in Europe. Was he still running the same networks? Was it a lot of like Hungarian spread out, for example?
Yeah, so they continued working with Hungarian emigres and that sort of thing. In fact, one of the Hungarians they'd worked with during the war ended up after the war living in Uruguay and ran operations for the pond in Uruguay for a number of years, where, again, they managed to get in a food fight with CIA. They also had access to information from some of the French police and security services, and it's not clear to me, this is post-war period, it's not clear to me if this is because they were spying on those organizations. I can't exclude that possibility. I don't think so. I think rather those organizations were giving them material, and whether that was as a formal thing where the French agencies in question like formally sort of had what they viewed as a liaison relationship with the pond, or whether it was simply individual officials in those organizations kind of exceeding their brief and sharing stuff isn't entirely clear to me. But they had a lot of reporting on, communist doings in France and stuff that the French security services were looking at. They seem to have had a similar sort of relationship and be plugged in at very high levels with the Norwegian intelligence service, particularly in Europe. But as I say, India, Southeast Asia, Middle East as well.
They had quite a reach for a small organization.
They really did. They did a lot with nothing. Whether the lot they did was worthwhile, a little less clear, but they did a lot with very little.
I seem to remember from the article that the budget that he was requesting, even in $1950, it did not sound like much at all, like $200,000 a year or something like that. I think it was.
I don't recall the numbers, but yes, it's remarkably small.
Yeah, well, that's impressive, and it's unfortunate that it fell apart due to personality conflicts and a few other small things that could have had a lot of potential, I think. Were there any other private organizations during that era or that you're aware of? I cannot think of any off the top of my head that are anything like the Pond at all.
So I know of one that I've done a little bit of research on. Someday I'm going to write about this too. There was a somewhat similar organization run by a guy named Julius Amos, who was a Greek American who had been in the Air Force, or I guess the Army Air Force technically, during World War II as an intel officer, and then had also been for a time in the OSS. In both places, he impressed his superiors as being wildly incompetent. But he put together a private sector organization after World War II that actually operated up until, I want to say about 1960 or so, maybe, doing somewhat similar sorts of things, allegedly. But his business model was different. He would, when he was able to, sell product to the CIA or other U.S. agencies who were willing to buy it. And there's some indications that there were one-off operations where he might have actually, gotten federal money we want you to go do X, right? But mostly what he did was his alleged espionage. He used to write newsletters, right, that you could subscribe to. And a great many businesses, plus just interested citizens, would subscribe to this newsletter, which was called the Inform, and be treated to the inside scoop on what was going on in Moscow or wherever. Almost certainly, almost everything that he produced was garbage, but he was running around out there. He claimed at one point to, tried to interest folks in the idea that he was going to be able to facilitate the defection of Lavrenti Beria.
Seems unlikely.
Stalin's right-hand man. Yeah, that didn't happen. But that, I think, gives a good idea of this kind of guy. There were other organizations floating around in Western Europe doing somewhat similar sorts of things to him, but I really don't know much about them. I have not personally looked into it. So there were a few, but my impression is, and it's hard, you don't know what you don't know, but my impression is that Grombach's Pond was, at least in the U.S. context, by far the organization that was most sort of actually plugged into no-kidding officialdom and actually playing a real role. You can debate how valuable, but a real role in the no-kidding U.S. intelligence.
Certainly sounds like it. So after the Pond kind of folded, what happened to Grombach?
So Grombach spent a few years sending letters to everybody he knew in the War Department, the State Department, NATO, all sorts of places saying, hey, we've got this network that's still kind of alive, and wouldn't you like to pick up our contract and, fund us? And nobody was biting. So then he spent the rest of his professional life working with this private investigative agency, basically doing, sort of corporate investigations and that sort of stuff. Every 4 years, he would write a guide to the Olympics. Up until, in fact, the last one he did, I think was, I forget if it was 76 or 80. He worked on his book, The Great Liquidator, which was about Marcel Petiot, the serial killer, which he got published, I think, in 1980 as well. Maybe 81. He died in 82. In retirement, he corresponded a lot with old Army friends and stuff and whatnot, typically people on the pretty far right, and they'd exchange letters about how this person or that person, high administration officials or senior Army officers were, in the tank for the commies and all this sort of stuff. And as I say, he died in, I believe it was 1982.
Well, he lived quite a vivid life. Certainly, and he had a big impact.
That's a great way of putting it, too. Yeah, vivid.
What a fascinating story. Well, I really appreciate this, Mark. This has been really interesting. And I know that you said you're expanding this into a book. So is there going to be some new information coming out in the book, some stuff that's been declassified since 2004 or so?
The backbone of the book will be, these records that were found in about 2001, 2002 in the barn in Virginia and made their way to the National Archives in 2010. So that's going to be the backbone of the book. And I'm hoping to bear down and really sort of put meat on the bones of some of these things that, like, okay, I can see that there's a story here somewhere, but I don't know what it is yet. I'm hoping to be able to, really do the hard work and figure some of that out. I have published 2 other things on the subject since that 2004 Studies in Intelligence article. Colleague and I, Katalin Kadar-Lin, wrote a piece in a scholarly journal, Intelligence and National Security, in 2016 on the Pons Hungarian operations, both during the war and then in the Cold War. And then I had a chapter in an edited volume called Spy Chiefs that came out in 2018 from Georgetown University Press, assessing Grombach as a leader. So there's a couple other things out there, but yeah, I'm hoping the book will do it and get Grombach out of my system, and and I can give that brain space to other research problems.
Yeah, understandable. Certainly. I feel the same way about a few different subjects myself. So you're going to start that next year. Do you have anything coming out this year? Are you working on something that you're wrapping up right now?
So I just, the day the Russians invaded Ukraine, I sent off to the publisher a book on the history of U.S. intelligence in World War I. That's going to be published by University Press of Kansas, and it's coming out in spring a year from now. Having cleared the decks on that, I'm going to finish off. I've got about 4 or 5 different journal articles on various aspects of intelligence history that are somewhere between 50 and 98% done that I'm going to finish. That'll get me into early next year, and then it's the Grombach book, I think.
Wow, you're a prolific writer, certainly.
Yeah. Well, I start more projects than I finish, but I'm hoping now that I'm, semi-retired that I can change that.
Yeah, tell me about it. I know that feeling. Certainly, I know it. Well, thank you, Mark. This has been super informative. I really appreciate it. Maybe we'll be able to come back for your World War I book once that's published in a year or so. I'm looking forward to that, certainly.
I'd love that. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101 or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes a free PDF copy of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Eddie A. and Joshua W. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcast or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.